November 1944. Just before dawn, radar stations around Tokyo come alive with signals, dozens of them. Large contacts, moving fast, coming straight in from the southeast. Phones ring, orders are issued, air raid alarms begin to wail across the city. At fighter bases outside the capital, pilots run for their aircraft. Engines roar to life in the cold morning air. Oxygen masks are pulled tight as propellers bite and fighters lift off, climbing hard toward the incoming threat. They know the enemy is coming. Radar has given them that. What they don't yet understand is how high. The fighters pass 20,000 feet, then 25. Engines begin to lose power. The air thins. Controls feel sluggish, heavy, unresponsive. Cylinder head temperatures creep into the red. The pilots keep climbing anyway. Then they see them. High above, thin white contrails stretch across the sky. Straight, steady, impossibly distant. 4 engine bombers cruise calmly at an altitude Japanese pilots were taught was only theoretical. Numbers written in manuals. Not a place where real combat happened. The fighters claw upward, throttles wide open, but the distance doesn't close. It widens. Airspeed bleeds away. Aircraft begin to shudder, then stall. One by one, the fighters nose over and fall back toward the earth, thousands of feet below the bombers they were sent to intercept. No shots are fired, no attacks are made. From the ground, anti-aircraft guns elevate to their maximum angle. Shells burst far below the formation, black puffs hanging uselessly in empty sky. Moments later, bombs begin to fall. Civilians look up and see silver contrails beyond reach. Pilots circle beneath them, powerless. Radar operators track the bombers perfectly, watching every mile of their approach, unable to do anything about it. That morning, Japanese fighters returned to base with fuel exhausted, ammunition untouched, and a realization that settles in with quiet dread. They had warning. They had fighters. They had brave, experienced pilots. But for the first time in the war, the enemy was not faster, not better trained, not outnumbering them in the air. The enemy was simply unreachable, and that changed everything. Before that morning over Tokyo, Japanese air defense doctrine had been built on certainty. For years, interceptor pilots had trained for a specific kind of war in the sky. Enemy bombers would come in at predictable altitudes, 20,000 feet, perhaps 25 at most, high but reachable, dangerous but manageable. That belief was not theory, it was experience. Earlier in the war, American heavy bombers had appeared over China, B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators operating from distant vulnerable bases. They flew high, but not impossibly high. Japanese fighters could reach them, intercept them, damage them, sometimes destroy them outright. From those encounters, tactics were refined. Pilots were taught never to climb during combat. Altitude was life. Energy was survival. The interceptor that reached the bomber first, already above it, held the advantage. From there, a single diving pass could overcome defensive guns and armor. This doctrine worked because it was built on the limits of human and machine endurance. Japanese fighters were optimized for medium-altitude combat. Their engines performed best where air was still dense enough to breathe, where controls remained responsive, where pilots could think clearly through oxygen masks that were never designed for prolonged extreme altitude. The expectation was simple. The enemy would come where combat was possible. Even Japan's anti-aircraft defenses reflected this assumption. Guns were calibrated, crews trained, firing tables calculated for bombers flying at altitudes that could be engaged with accuracy. Everything, from radar tracking to fighter vectoring, was built around the same ceiling, 25,000 feet, maybe a little higher, in perfect conditions, but not beyond reach. So when reports began filtering in during 1944, intelligence hints of a new American bomber operating from the Mariana Islands, the implications were not fully understood. 4 engines, long range, heavy payload, impressive yes, dangerous certainly, but still a bomber. Japanese planners assumed it would behave like every other bomber before it, that it would share the same vulnerabilities, the same limits imposed by cold, thin air and human physiology. No one imagined crews working comfortably above 30,000 feet. No one imagined engines maintaining full power where others suffocated. No one imagined a bomber designed not to survive interception, but to avoid it entirely. So when the first formations appeared over Tokyo, doctrine was followed perfectly. Radar gave warning. Fighters were scrambled early. Pilots climbed hard, engines straining as they raced to gain altitude before contact. Everything was done by the book. And still, they could not reach them. That was the moment Japanese air defense realized the rules they had trained by no longer applied. They had prepared for a war that no longer existed, and the bombers overhead were proof. The aircraft approaching Tokyo that morning did not behave like any bomber Japanese pilots had ever faced. From a distance, it looked familiar enough. 4 engines, broad wings, a long silver fuselage. But everything about the way it moved through the sky felt wrong. The formation held steady above 30,000 feet, adjusting course with calm precision. No desperate climbs, no shallow descents to ease engine strain. The bombers cruised as if the thin air did not exist. Because for their cruise, it almost didn't. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress had been designed for a different kind of war, one where altitude itself was the primary defense. Unlike earlier American bombers, the B-29 was built around pressurized crew compartments. Inside the aircraft, the air was warm. Breathing was easy. Men worked without heavy flight suits, without numb fingers, without the creeping fog of hypoxia. While Japanese pilots strained for oxygen and fought stiffening controls, B-29 crews operated in relative comfort, focused entirely on navigation, formation keeping, and bombing accuracy. The engines made the difference. Each Superfortress carried 4 powerful radial engines equipped with turbo superchargers, complex systems that compressed thin air and forced it into the engine at pressure. Where Japanese engines lost power with every 1,000 feet gained, the B-29's engines kept producing nearly full output. At altitude, the Superfortress was not struggling, it was cruising. True airspeed remained high. Formation spacing stayed tight. The bombers could maneuver, adjust altitude slightly to ride winds, and still remain far above interceptor reach. For Japanese fighters, the experience was humiliating. Specifications on paper claimed service ceilings that approached the bomber's altitude. But combat reality was cruel. At extreme height, engines overheated while producing only a fraction of their rated power. Control surfaces responded slowly, as if moving through syrup. Airspeed dropped to the edge of a stall. Even fighters designed specifically for interception reached the bombers exhausted, if they reached them at all. Those few pilots who managed brief firing positions discovered another problem. Climbing attacks robbed bullets of velocity. Tracers fell short. Cannons fired once or twice before gravity and thin air ended the attempt. The bombers did not need to evade. They simply stayed where no one could follow. Defensive fire from the Superfortresses tracked attackers automatically, coordinated through centralized fire control systems. Gunners did not hang exposed in freezing blisters. They sat inside pressurized compartments, operating weapons through sights linked to analog. Computers. Technology far beyond anything Japanese forces possessed. And still, most of the time, they didn't need to fire. Altitude was enough. From the ground, Japanese commanders watched their defenses fail in real time. Radar provided perfect information: heading, speed, altitude. Fighters launched early. Anti-aircraft batteries stood ready. But information without capability meant nothing. The bombers passed overhead untouched, dropped their loads, and turned for home with minimal loss. Not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, not because gunners lacked skill, but because the Superfortress had moved the battlefield to a place Japan could not reach. The ceiling of air combat had been broken, and Japan had no answer. The mission reports that came back that day were brief, clinical, almost embarrassed. Pilots described the same sequence again and again. They scrambled early. They climbed as hard as their aircraft allowed. They saw the bombers. And then they stalled. Fighters reached the edge of their performance envelope long before they reached the enemy. Airspeed fell below safe margins. Engines overheated. Oil pressure fluctuated wildly. Controls lost their bite, becoming slow and unresponsive in the thin air. Pilots who forced their aircraft higher paid for it immediately. A moment too long at full throttle, and the engine would cough, sputter, or seize. A A second too slow on the controls, and the aircraft would shudder violently before dropping away in an uncontrolled fall. Every climb attempt ended the same way. The bombers remained above them, steady, ordered, indifferent. Those few pilots who managed to reach near firing range discovered how cruel altitude could be. Cannons fired uphill lost velocity almost instantly. Machine gun rounds arced uselessly through empty sky, falling thousands of feet short. Even perfect aim meant nothing when physics refused to cooperate. Anti-aircraft batteries fared no better. Guns were elevated to their absolute limits. Crews fired until barrels glowed and recoil shook the platforms. Shells burst far below the bomber formations, black clouds blooming in useless patterns that never touched the silver shapes above. Observers on the ground watched contrails pass directly overhead while explosions detonated harmlessly beneath them. The bombers flew on. In debriefings, pilots spoke quietly. There was no panic, no exaggeration, just confusion and disbelief. They had followed doctrine. They had done everything correctly. Yet the enemy was beyond reach from the moment contact was made. Commanders tried to explain it away at first. Perhaps the weather had favored the Americans. Perhaps the fighters had launched too late. Perhaps a handful of engagements had simply gone badly. But the next raids produced the same results. And the next. By the end of November 1944, a pattern had become impossible to ignore. Dozens of bombers crossed Japanese airspace in daylight. Radar tracked them perfectly. Fighters rose to meet them every time, and almost none were touched. Pilots began returning to base with full ammunition loads, not because they lacked targets, but because they never truly reached one. Some landed in silence. Others slammed canopies shut and sat motionless in their cockpits, staring straight ahead. For the first time in the war, Japanese air defense faced an enemy that could operate freely above the homeland. Not because Japan lacked pilots, not because it lacked courage, but because the battlefield itself had moved beyond reach. The realization settled in slowly, and then all at once. If nothing changed, the bombers would come again, and there would be nothing to stop them. Once denial faded, improvisation took its place. Japanese air defense commanders knew the problem now. Altitude, not tactics, not bravery, not numbers. The bombers were operating in a band of sky Japanese fighters could barely enter and could not survive. In for long. So they tried to push the machines past what they were built to endure. Fighters were stripped down wherever possible. Armor plating was removed. Radios were taken out. Ammunition loads were reduced to the bare minimum. Anything that added weight, anything at all, was sacrificed for a few more feet of climb. Engines were pushed beyond design limits. Pilots were ordered to use emergency power for entire climbs, accepting damage as inevitable. Manifold pressures exceeded red lines. Cylinder head temperatures crept toward failure with every passing minute. Maintenance crews watched in silence as aircraft they had spent months keeping alive were deliberately driven toward destruction. The pilots understood the risks. They flew anyway. To survive the climb, many pre-breathed pure oxygen before takeoff. Even then, oxygen systems were never designed for sustained operations at extreme altitude. Masks froze, valves malfunctioned, hypoxia crept in quietly, stealing judgment and reaction time without warning. Some pilots blacked out during the climb. Others lost peripheral vision, then consciousness entirely. A few never recovered before their aircraft stalled and fell away. Those who reached near the bomber's altitude did so exhausted, engines overheating, airspeed barely above stall. There was no energy left to fight, no margin for maneuver. One firing pass, if that. Bullets still fell short, cannons fired briefly, then silence as pilots were forced to dive to recover control. Any attempt to climb again risked catastrophic engine failure. Ground controllers tried new approaches. Fighters were launched earlier, vectored farther out, given more time to climb. Radar guidance was precise, timing was perfect. The result never changed. The bombers crossed Japanese airspace with mechanical indifference. Crews worked calmly in pressurized cabins while interceptors gasped for oxygen below them. Every raid cost Japan more than aircraft. Engines destroyed themselves under strain. Pilots accumulated fatigue and frostbite. Maintenance resources were consumed keeping fighters barely operational for the next attempt. And still, the bombers came back. By December 1944, the pattern was undeniable. Japan was expending men, machines, and fuel for interceptions that achieved almost nothing. But surrendering the attempt was unthinkable, so the pressure intensified. If stripped fighters and overdriven engines were not enough, then the pilots themselves would have to close the gap by any means necessary. By late 1944, Japanese commanders accepted a hard truth. No fighter could climb from the ground and catch the bombers in time, so the doctrine itself was rewritten. Interceptors would no longer chase the enemy upward. Instead, fighters were ordered to reach maximum altitude before the bombers arrived. Pilots climbed early, hours in advance, orbiting at the edge of endurance while radar tracked the incoming formations. The plan was simple. Be waiting above the bombers, dive once, hit hard, escape. On paper, it was sound. It mirrored the very principles Japanese pilots had relied on since the beginning of the war. In reality, it failed almost immediately. Even with perfect timing, fighters struggled to hold extreme altitude. Engines overheated while producing minimal power. Fuel consumption skyrocketed. Pilots fought hypoxia while circling in thin, freezing air, waiting for contrails to appear. Many aircraft were forced to descend before contact was ever made. Those that managed to show discipline, to stay high long enough, found themselves still below the bombers, sometimes by a few hundred feet, sometimes by several thousand. The dive never came. Pilots tried zoom climbs instead, trading every knot of speed for altitude in a last desperate surge. Fighters arced upward toward the formations, engines screaming, airspeed bleeding away second by second. A few reached firing range, briefly. They fired short bursts, cannons chattering for seconds at most before gravity reclaimed them. The moment the climb peaked, the aircraft stalled. Controls went soft. The fighter dropped away violently, spinning or plunging until thicker air returned. There was no chance to reposition, no second pass, no pursuit. The bombers absorbed the attacks, or never noticed them at all, and flew on. Reports from these missions read like variations of the same failure. Reached near altitude. Unable to maintain energy. Forced to disengage. No confirmed results. Japanese pilots were doing everything asked of them. They were flying with precision, discipline, and extraordinary restraint under impossible conditions. And still, the outcome never changed. From the bomber crew's perspective, the sky remained strangely quiet. They could see fighters climbing far below, tiny specks straining upward, then stalling and falling away. Defensive gunners tracked them calmly, often without firing. The bombers did not need to maneuver. They did not need to break formation. Altitude protected them better than armor ever could. By early 1945, the conclusion was unavoidable. Japan could refine tactics endlessly, but tactics could not overcome physics. No amount of timing or discipline could bridge the gap between where fighters could operate and where the bombers lived. With options running out, Japanese planners turned to the one variable they had left. If fighters could not fight at that altitude, then perhaps they could still collide with it. By early 1945, Japanese air defense faced a reality it could no longer avoid. Interception, as it had been understood for decades, was failing. The bombers were too high, the engines too powerful. The air itself belonged to the enemy. So Japan turned to an option that required no sustained altitude, no pursuit, no second chance. Collision. Special attack units were formed quietly at first. Volunteer. Pilots were selected from experienced squadrons, men who already understood what the odds were. Their aircraft were stripped even further than before. Armor removed, radios discarded, ammunition reduced or eliminated entirely. Some fighters carried no guns at all. Fuel loads were calculated for one climb, one approach, nothing more. The objective was brutally simple: reach the bomber formation by any means, line up a single attack, and ram. Briefings were honest. There were no illusions of survival. Pilots were told exactly what was expected of them and exactly what it would cost. They accepted. On the ground, maintenance crews prepared the aircraft in silence. Engines were tuned for maximum short-term output, not longevity. Emergency boost settings were pushed past limits that would normally ground an aircraft immediately. Pilots pre-breathed oxygen for extended periods before takeoff, trying to stave off hypoxia during the climb. Even so, many would lose vision. coordination, or consciousness before reaching altitude. Those who did reach the bomber formation approached from below in steep zoom climbs, engines screaming as every last bit of airspeed was converted into height. Defensive guns opened fire, 50 caliber tracers arcing downward with lethal precision. Some fighters were shredded before they ever came close. A few reached striking distance. Even then, success was rare. Fighters often stalled just short of impact, dropping away beneath the bombers they were meant to destroy. Others clipped wings or tails without inflicting fatal damage. Occasionally, a collision succeeded, metal tearing into metal, both aircraft spiraling down together. Each success was celebrated, each loss was expected. But even these sacrifices changed nothing. Ramming attacks were unpredictable, unsustainable, and impossible to coordinate against large formations. For every bomber destroyed, dozens more flew on untouched. The bomber stream remained intact. The targets burned. For Japanese pilots, the psychological toll was immense. They were no longer fighting for air superiority or even local defense. They were being asked to trade their lives for the possibility of damage. And still, the bombers returned. The formation of ramming units was an admission, even if no one said it aloud. Japan could not defeat the bombers with tactics. It could not outclimb them. It could not outgun them. All that remained was sacrifice. But sacrifice could not close the altitude gap. And the war in the sky continued on terms Japan did not control. In March 1945, something changed. Radar stations detected the familiar bomber streams approaching Japan, but this time, the altitude readings were wrong, too low, far lower than before. Japanese commanders hesitated, then confirmed it. The bombers were descending. For months, the B-29s had lived beyond reach. Now, suddenly, they were coming in at 5,000 to 9,000 feet, low enough to be intercepted, low enough to be fought. For the first time since the Superfortresses appeared, Japanese fighters could climb without strain. Engines ran smoothly. Controls responded crisply. Pilots reached the enemy with speed and energy to spare. At last they could fight. Interceptors slashed into the bomber stream under cover of darkness. Cannons found targets. Tracers walked across wings and engine nacelles. Some B-29s caught fire and fell away, burning across the night sky. Searchlights stabbed upward, pinning individual bombers in cones of white light. Anti-aircraft guns fired point blank, shells bursting among the formations instead of far below them. Pilots reported hits. Bombers were damaged. Some were destroyed. For a brief moment, it felt like the balance had shifted. But the bombers kept coming. The Americans had not descended out of weakness. They had changed tactics. By flying low and at night, the B-29s avoided the jet stream winds that had scattered bombs at high altitude. Defensive guns were stripped away to carry more incendiaries. Formations were looser, faster, harder to track in darkness. And when the bombs fell, they did not strike factories alone. They struck cities. Tokyo burned. Firestorms raced through wooden neighborhoods faster than any fire brigade could respond. Entire districts vanished beneath rolling walls of flame. The damage eclipsed anything the high-altitude raids had achieved. Japanese fighters fought desperately that night, making repeated attacks, sometimes scoring multiple hits on a single aircraft. But darkness erased coordination. Radios failed. Pilots often lost their targets after one pass, swallowed by smoke and fire. Losses mounted on both sides. And still, it wasn't enough. For every bomber destroyed, dozens reached their targets. For every successful interception, entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath the flames. Worse still, the hope was temporary. As quickly as the tactic appeared, it became clear what it meant. The bombers could choose their altitude. They could come down when it suited them, and they could climb back up whenever they wished. Japan's brief moment of parity vanished as suddenly as it had arrived. The fires still burned, the cities still suffered, and the bombers, once the lesson had been learned, began drifting upward again, back toward the sanctuary, back to a place Japanese fighters could not follow. The realization was crushing. Even when the enemy entered reach, Japan could not stop the destruction, and when the bombers returned to altitude, there would be nothing left to try. The false hope of March 1945 faded into smoke and ash. And above it all, the contrails began to reappear. By the spring of 1945, Japan's aircraft industry was racing time it no longer had. New fighters began appearing at frontline bases, machines that on paper promised a solution. More powerful engines, improved climb rates, higher advertised ceilings. At last, designs meant to face the Superfortress. Pilots greeted them with cautious hope. Aircraft like the Ki-84 Hayate and the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden were faster and more heavily armed than earlier fighters. In test conditions, they could reach altitudes that matched the bombers. Some pilots even managed to climb above 30,000 feet. But combat was not a test flight. At extreme altitude, the same problems returned. Engines lost power despite their size. Superchargers struggled. Controls became sluggish, delayed by thin air and stiffened hydraulics. Pilots reached the bomber stream with just enough energy for a single pass, if they reached it at all. There was no pursuit. A fighter that missed its first attack had no chance to climb again. The bombers maintained speed and formation, sliding calmly away while interceptors fell behind, powerless to follow. Even when contact was made, the margin for success was razor thin. Pilots had seconds to line up a shot, fire, and escape before gravity reclaimed them. Any mistake meant an immediate stall and a violent dive back toward thicker air. And now there was another problem. American escort fighters began appearing over Japan itself. Long-range P-51 Mustangs, operating from newly captured bases, cut into what little freedom Japanese interceptors still had. Fighters climbing to meet the bombers were attacked from above, below, and behind. Any attempt to focus on the superfortresses invited swift destruction. Interceptions became lethal before they even began. The few new fighters that did reach operational units arrived in small numbers, plagued by maintenance issues and fuel shortages. Engines were powerful but fragile. Spare parts were scarce. Training hours were limited. Experienced pilots were harder to replace than aircraft. Meanwhile, the bombers kept coming. Factories that produced engines and airframes were themselves destroyed from the air. Each raid reduced Japan's ability to field the very aircraft meant to stop the next one. It became a vicious cycle, new fighters arriving too slowly in too few numbers to make any meaningful difference. Pilots understood it immediately. They were flying the best aircraft Japan had left. And still, the bombers remained out of reach. The sky above 30,000 feet belonged to the enemy. Below it waited American escorts, and between them, Japanese fighters were being squeezed out of the war entirely. By the summer of 1945, daylight interception had become almost symbolic. Fighters launched because they were ordered to. They climbed because they were trained to. But few expected results. The superfortresses flew on, secure in their sanctuary, while Japan's last hopes arrived too late, and in numbers far too small to matter. When American escort fighters began appearing over Japan itself, the balance in the air shifted again. For months, Japanese pilots had faced a single, impossible problem, the altitude of the bombers. Now they faced two. Long-range P-51 Mustangs, operating from newly captured island bases, arrived ahead of the bomber streams. Sleek, fast, and aggressive, they swept Japanese airspace with a freedom once reserved for the superfortresses alone. For Japanese interceptors, the timing could not have been worse. Fighters climbing to meet the bombers were now intercepted during the climb itself, when engines were strained and airspeed was low. Any maneuver to evade an escort cost altitude. Any attempt to fight back sacrificed the climb entirely. Pilots found themselves attacked from below before they could reach above. Those who pressed on toward the bombers did so knowing they were being watched. The moment they committed to an attack run, Mustangs dropped in behind them with overwhelming speed and firepower. A fighter that survived its first engagement was often shot down while attempting to escape. Interception became a one-way mission even without ramming. Japanese commanders tried to adapt, but there was nowhere left to maneuver. Fighters that stayed low were destroyed by escorts. Fighters that climbed high stalled beneath the bombers. Any concentration of aircraft was quickly broken up by American patrols that roamed freely across the sky. The sense of isolation deepened. Pilots reported feeling trapped between two unreachable enemies, bombers above them, escorts around them. Radios crackled with warnings that came too late. Ground controllers issued vectors knowing there was no safe path forward. The air war was no longer a contest, it was a containment. American escorts did more than protect the bombers. They severed Japan's last remaining confidence that skill and bravery might still matter. Even the best pilots, flying the most advanced aircraft available, were cut down before they could reach the enemy they were sworn to stop. Losses mounted quickly. Each trained pilot lost was irreplaceable. Fuel shortages reduced training. Hours. New aircraft arrived without crews prepared to fly them to their limits. Veterans who had survived years of combat disappeared in seconds against an enemy that dictated every engagement. Above it all, the superfortresses continued unchallenged. They flew straight and level to their targets, formations unbroken, bombing runs steady and deliberate. The presence of escorts meant bomber crews no longer worried about interception at any altitude. The sky was theirs from top to bottom. By mid-1945, Japanese pilots understood what the escorts truly meant. The bombers no longer needed altitude sanctuary alone. They were now protected everywhere. Japan's fighters were isolated, outclimbed, outgunned, and surrounded. The airspace above the homeland had become hostile territory, and with that realization came a final, quiet understanding. The war in the air was over. The only question left was how it would end. In August 1945, Japan still had radar. It still had fighter bases. It still had pilots willing to climb. And on the morning of August 6th, it had warning. Radar stations detected a lone aircraft approaching from the southeast. The track was clear, steady, unmistakable. Ground controllers followed it easily, calling out heading, speed, and altitude as the contact crossed the coast and moved inland. Fighter units were scrambled immediately. Pilots launched without hesitation. Engines roared as aircraft climbed hard toward the reported position. The weather was clear. Conditions were perfect. There would be no excuses this time. The altitude reading came in, over 30,000 feet. Once again, fighters strained upward, throttles wide open. Airspeed bled away. Engines began to falter. Pilots watched their altimeters climb, then stop. Some reached 27,000 feet. A few pushed past 28. None reached the bomber. Above them, the B-29 flew alone, unchallenged. There were no escorts. There was no formation to hide. Within, there was no defensive maneuvering at all. It did not need protection. The pilots below never understood what kind of mission they were witnessing. To them, it was simply another superfortress operating where they could not follow. Another target that existed only as a radar return and a silver shape against the sky. They circled beneath it, powerless, engines overheating, controls growing soft and unreliable. Then the bomb was released. A blinding flash erupted over Hiroshima. The shockwave raced outward, flattening the city in seconds. From the airfields and radar stations, crews saw the rising column of smoke and cloud boiling upward through the very altitudes their fighters could never reach. 3 days later, it happened again. Another lone bomber approached Nagasaki. Radar tracked it perfectly. Fighters launched again, desperate to intercept. Once more, they stalled thousands of feet below the aircraft they could see, but not touch. The bomb fell. In both cases, Japan had warning. It had fighters in the air. It had men willing to die trying. And none of it mattered. The atomic missions were not defeated by surprise or secrecy. They succeeded because the bombers operated in a sanctuary that no interceptor could penetrate. The enemy could be seen, tracked, anticipated, and still left entirely unopposed. For Japanese pilots, the meaning was unmistakable. This was not a failure of courage. It was not a failure of tactics. It was not even a failure of aircraft design alone. It was the final demonstration that the war in the air had been decided long before August 1945. Decided by altitude, by engineering, by industrial power. When the last fighters returned to base that summer, many pilots shut down their engines in silence. There was nothing left to attempt, nothing left to adapt. They had climbed as high as they could, and the enemy had simply flown higher. When the war ended, Japanese pilots struggled to explain what had happened in the skies above their homeland. It was not fear that defeated them, nor a lack of skill, nor a shortage of men willing to fight. Again and again they had reached the limits of their machines, and then pushed past them. Engines were overdriven until they failed. Aircraft were stripped to bare frames. Oxygen systems were pushed beyond what the human body could endure. Pilots climbed until their vision narrowed, their hands went numb, and their aircraft shook on the edge of a stall. And still, it was not enough. They could see the enemy. They could track him on radar. They could watch the bombers cross the sky in perfect formation. What they could not do was reach them. In the end, the air war over Japan was not decided by heroism or doctrine. It was decided by engineering tables, factory output, and the quiet mathematics of altitude and power. The decisive battles were fought years earlier, on drafting boards, in test chambers, and on assembly lines thousands of miles away. The B-29 did not win because it was invincible. It won because it operated where interception was no longer possible. For Japanese pilots, that truth carried a deep and lasting weight. Many later wrote that the worst moment was not being shot at, or even losing comrades, but circling helplessly beneath contrails they could never reach, knowing their cities lay unprotected below. They had been trained to fight other pilots, to outthink them, to outfly them. Instead, they were asked to fight physics, and physics does not bend for courage. The lesson of the Superfortress raids was harsh but enduring. In modern war, bravery alone is never enough. Victory belongs to those who control the environment itself, who choose where combat happens, and who make sure the enemy can never reach them. High above Japan in 1944 and 1945, the war was already decided, not by the men in the cockpits, but by the sky they could not climb into.